Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we started working on adding an audio game object support to our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so now that we've added in our logic and our utility method for playing background music in our game, what we're going to do next is we're going to focus on adding in sound effects to our game, and we're going to also add a utility function to do that. And so for sound effects in our game, they're going to be a little bit different than our background music in that we only want these sounds to play one time. And so we're going to want to go ahead and fire it off, have our audio manager play that audio all the way through, and then it'll go ahead and clean it up for us when it's done. And so we're not actually going to want it to loop. And so what's really nice about this is we're going to be able to fire and forget. And so we'll be able to tell our audio manager to go ahead and play this audio sound, and then it'll go ahead and just do the cleanup for us. And then that way we can play it multiple times, and we don't have to worry about doing this additional logic like we did for our background music. And so to go ahead and get started with our code, what we're going to do is we're going to extend our audio utils to have a new function for playing these sound effects, and that way we keep all of our audio logic in one location. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is let's make a new function. And we're just going to do export function, and we're going to call this play sound fx. And so for this, we'll need our two parameters of our scene and our audio key. And so we need our phaser scene, so we can grab our sound manager to go ahead and play a sound. And we'll need the audio key of the asset that we want to go ahead and play. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to copy this block of code up here for our type definitions for JS doc. And then what we'll do is similar to what we did up here, we're just going to add a safety check. So if our data manager, if our sound option is set to off, we'll go ahead and not play anything. We'll just return early. So if we are set up to go ahead and play sound, then all we need to do is just call our play method on our sound manager with our audio key. And instead of setting our loop to true, what we're actually going to do on this one is we're going to go ahead and set our volume property. And so for our volume, typically this is between 0 and 1 if you want full volume. But you can actually multiply this by another value to go ahead and keep increasing the volume of that sound. And so for some of our sound effects, these are very low in volume compared to our background music. And so we're going to want to have a base value for these. So then that way they're a little bit louder and we can hear them over our background music. And so to do this, all we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and multiply these by 20. And so by setting our volume to 20, this is just going to multiply our initial sound value and make it much louder in our game. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to update our world scene to go ahead and call our new method when our player walks in grass. And then that way we can go ahead and test our functionality. So what we'll want to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and jump over to our world scene. So in our world scene, what we'll want to do is come to our handle player movement method. And so inside our method, right after we do our console log for where our player's in an encounter zone, we're going to go ahead and just play our sound effect. And so later on, like if we have our player moving in like water, we want to check to see what type of encounter zone it is. So we play a different sound effect. And so we're just going to call playing sound FX. And then for this, we're going to go ahead and pass in our scene. And now we need our audio asset keys. And let's pass in grass. All right, so we're going to test our changes. Let's go and do new game. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate our player over by our encounter area. And we'll go ahead and save our game. So we're right next to it. And then so what we should be able to do is if we go ahead and move through our grass, we should hear our sound effect play for every time we take a step in our game. And we'll notice that we can hear this over our background music. So if we want to see a difference, we come back to our audio utils. Let's go ahead and set our initial value back to 1 for our volume. And let's go ahead and do continue. And now what we should notice is when we step into our grass, it's very hard to hear our sound effect play over our background music. And so we can see how our volume property here is modifying the output of the sound in our browser. All right, so one thing to note is we could modify our volume on our background music and reduce it, but for the time being, we're just going to go ahead and update our volume on our sound effects so they're louder and we can hear them over our background music. All right, so one other thing we want to do with our sound effects is when we play them, we don't want to always just use a volume of 20. We actually want to base them off our volume setting that we set in our options menu. So originally when we set up our options menu, we set up our volume bar to allow us to do up to 25, 50, 75, or 100% of our overall volume. And so we want to use this when we set our volume here. And so to go ahead and do that, we need to grab this value from our data manager and then multiply this by that value. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is make a new variable. And we're just going to call this base volume. And we're going to set this equal to our data manager. We'll reference our store, and we're going to use the get method. Let's grab our data manager store keys, and we want to use our options and then our volume. And then what we want to do is we want to multiply this by 0.25. So then that way we have the correct value. And so the reason we're doing this is for our options value. When we initially set this, we're using a value of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so by multiplying this by 0.25, this is going to give us a number between 0 and 1. So then what we can do is multiply our 20 by our base volume, and this is going to modify our sound volume that's playing in our game. All right, so we want to go ahead and test our changes. What we'll do is if we refresh our game, let's go into our options menu. Let's go ahead and set our volume down to 0. And then what we'll do is let's do to continue. And if we move in our grass, we'll see that we can no longer hear our sound object playing. And so if we come back to our options menu, if we bump this up to like 50, what we should notice is once we continue our game, our sound effect should play, but it should be much lower than it was before. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and reset this back to 100. So now that we have our logic in place for playing our sound effects in our world scene, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to extend this to also work in our battle scene. And so what we'll do is let's jump over to our battle scene. And the first sound effect we're going to add is we're going to add one for when we're trying to flee from battle and we flee successfully. So to go ahead and do this, let's come down to the bottom of our class and we're going to come down to where we flee from battle. And so we're going to come down to where you got away safely. And so inside our callback, we're going to go ahead and play our sound effects. And so what we'll do is we'll reference our new function, and so we'll do play sound effects. And then what we want to do is we'll pass in our phaser scene. And then we want to go ahead and pass in our audio key. So let's go ahead and grab our audio asset keys, and we're going to pass in flee. So besides our flee sound effect, we also want to go ahead and add in the ones for when our monsters attack. All right, and so for us to actually add in our sound effects for our attacks, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to extend some of our JSON data. And so if we can go ahead and open up our attacks.json file, currently we have this JSON file that has all of the metadata tied to our attack. And so it has an ID, the name, and which animation should play when the monster uses this attack. And then in our monsters JSON, what we have is we have a reference to our attack ID, and then basically build out this dynamic attack based on that metadata. And so similar to like what we did for our animation name, we're going to go ahead and add in a field for our audio asset key that should be used. And then that way, when we use this attack, we'll go ahead and play that audio sound effect for that particular attack. And to go ahead and do this, we're just going to add a new field, and we're going to call this audio key. And for this, we'll go ahead and pass in ice for our audio asset key. And then for here, go ahead and copy, let's go ahead and paste. And now this one's going to be called claw. And then what we're going to do real quick is let's jump over to our type definition to where we define our attack. And we're going to go ahead and add in that new key. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and just copy this here. We're going to go ahead and paste that. All right, and so instead of name, this will be audio key. And then for our description, what we'll do is we'll just say the unique key of the audio asset that is cached by phaser will be passed to the phaser sound manager to play this audio object. All right, so now we've added that to our type, what we should be able to do is over in our battle scene, when one of our monsters attacks, we should be able to go ahead and grab that property. And so what we'll do first, let's come to our player attack method. And what we'll do is right above our play attack animation, we're going to go ahead and play our sound effects. So what we'll do is we're going to add a delay call just so there's a small delay. So that way, since our animations take a little bit longer before we play our sound. And so we're just going to do this time, we'll do delayed call. And we're just going to do 100 milliseconds to start with. And for our callback, what we want to go ahead and do is reference our play sound effects. And we'll pass in our scene. And so for this, we want to go ahead and grab our active player monster. And from our active player monster, we want to go ahead and grab their attacks. And we want to go ahead and grab the active monster player attack index. And then we want to go ahead and grab our new audio key property. And so what we'll go ahead and do is we want to go ahead and copy this block of code. Let's come down to where we have our enemy attack. And similarly, before we do our play attack animation, we'll go ahead and paste this. But now let's go ahead and update our references. So we want our active enemy monster attacks, and we want our active enemy attack index. All right, and so with our changes, we should be able to go ahead and test. So let's go ahead and continue our game. And if we go ahead and go up to where we encounter a monster, let's go ahead and start a battle. And so after our battle starts, we should be able to go ahead and choose our monster's attack, and then the enemy should also choose their attack. And what we should hear is 2 sound effects play for each of the attacks that was used. And so it's quite fast because we have our animations turned off, but if we had them turned on, they'd be delayed and played out individually. Alright, so now that we have our audio working for our battle scene, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and finish setting up our audio settings to be tied to our sound manager. And so currently, if we jump over to our audio tills, what we did is for our sound effects, we are using some of our settings to go ahead and modify our volume there. And we also, for each of our functions, we actually check to see if our sound is on before we play one of our audio sounds. And so what we're going to want to do now is we actually want to tie our volume into our actual sound manager. And that way we'll control the overall volume for our game. And so to go ahead and do this, we're going to go ahead and make a new function. And so let's go ahead and do export function. And we're going to call this set global sound settings. And for this, we'll need our phaser 3 scene. And so what I'm going to do real quick, I'm just going to copy our JS doc type here. We're going to go ahead and paste. Let's go ahead and get rid of our second parameter because we won't need it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change our comment real quick. We'll say the phaser 3 scene to get the sound manager reference from. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to reference our phaser 3 scene. We're going to grab our sound manager. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call our set volume method. And so what this method does is it allows us to set our global volume for the sound manager. And so typically this is a volume between 0 and 1. It defaults to 1. So whatever volume our audio file's at, that's what's going to play at in our browser. And if we want to go ahead and lower that setting or make it louder, we can go ahead and multiply that value like we saw before. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to grab our value from our data manager for our options volume. And so basically what we did up here, and we're going to use that for setting our volume. And so if we just copy this block of code here, we're going to go ahead and paste that into our set volume method. And so what this is going to do, we're going to have a value of either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And we're just going to multiply that by 0.25 to get our value of between 0 and 1. And so that's going to affect our overall volume. And the last thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and use the set mute method to go ahead and mute our audio in our game. And so if we do scene, we grab our sound manager, let's go ahead and do set mute. And what this will do is it'll go ahead and mute all of our sounds if it's true. Otherwise, if it's false, we'll unmute our game. So typically in like some games, you'll see there's a button to mute all of your audio. This is one way you can do that. And for our setting, what we're going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to copy this here. And what we want to reference is our options and our sound. And we're just going to do a check to see if it's set to sound options.off. And what this is going to do is if we have our sound options off, we can disable all audio in our game. So if, we decide to add audio later and we don't go through our utility here, this will allow us to control it unless we create a new sound manager instance. All right, so before we can test our changes, we need to go ahead and actually call our new function. And what we're going to want to do is from our preload scene, we want to go ahead and call this method. So then that will we pass it our initial settings and it'll affect our overall sound manager. So let's go ahead and jump over to our preload scene. And what we'll do is let's come down to our bottom of our create method. And after we do our data manager, let's go ahead and call our set global sound settings and we'll pass in our phaser scene. And then that way we'll affect the sound manager before we ever get to our title scene. And then our volume should be affected accordingly. And so the second place we'll want to go ahead and call this function is we want to do this from our options scene. So let's jump over to our options scene real quick. And what we do is before we exit our options scene and we save our data, we want to go ahead and call this function so then that way we can update the sound manager with our latest settings. And so what we want to do is let's come down to our update method. And when we go ahead and we go back to our previous scene, so we update our data in our data manager, we'll also go ahead and add in code to go ahead and update our sound settings. And so we'll go ahead and pass in this for our scene, and we'll go ahead and save. And so with those two changes, we should be able to test our code. And so what we'll do is let's come over to our browser. And so go ahead and test. Let's go ahead and go into our options scene. So currently we should hear our background music playing in our title scene. And what we're going to do is let's first start off by lowering our volume to 50%. As soon as we hit close and we save our options, we should notice our audio in our game now is lower than it was before. And if we come back to our options, let's go ahead and drop it down to 0%. And we should not hear any audio because the volume's at 0. And if we come back, let's go ahead and bump that back up to 100%. And now our volume should be back to the original volume. And let's go ahead and test our mute functionality. Let's go ahead and turn off our sound. And so now we should notice that none of our audio should actually be playing, even though if it was playing before, because we muted our game. And if we come back in, if we unmute our game, we should now hear our sound again. All right, perfect. And so with those new changes, that sets us up later for if we want to add an option setting to our in-game menu while we're in our world scene. And then that way we could modify our audio settings and give that option to our players. All right, with that actually brings this video to an end. And that actually wraps up our audio section in our series. So in our next video, we'll be starting our world scene part 3 section. And this is where we'll be adding in new functionality to our world scene. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be taking a look at how we can add some advanced logic for encountering wild monsters. And so we'll start off with something simple where in one of our areas, we'll just introduce randomness for which monster we actually encounter. And so now instead of encountering the same monster over and over again, we'll have a random monster that can appear. Later on, we'll go ahead and refactor this to use an algorithm. So then that way we can modify the likelihood of which monster will appear in an area. Then we'll go ahead and we'll be taking a look at how we can actually introduce buildings in the interior and how we can transition between our world scene and one of these buildings. And we'll be looking at how we can build that out in tiled. And then finally, we'll be introducing some items to our game that we can pick up from our field. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see some links on your screen now.